Matt Gaetz, a member of the 116th Congress, is currently serving his second term. He's a member of the House Armed Services Committee and the Judiciary Committee. His work in Congress focuses on national security, tax reform, regulatory reform, and adherence to constitutional principles. Matt is devoted to the values upon which our country was founded, earning the nickname of Constitutional Conservative Champion. Matt is an active member on the Climate Solutions, Reformers, Animal Protection, and Robotics caucuses. Matt's proud to be a part of the historic passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which provided tax relief for workers, families, and job creators. And he helped with that tax cuts to revitalize our nation's economy. Matt graduated from Florida State University with a bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary sciences, and he received his Juris Doctorate from William and Mary Law School. Matt was born in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, and is the son of Don and Vicki Gaetz. Matt's a lifetime member of the National Rifle Association, and he has always maintained an A+ rating with them. He's a member of the First Baptist Church in Fort Walton Beach, and when he's not fighting for his constituents, he enjoys spending time with his family and with his dog, Scarlet. Matt has built a reputation as an outspoken defender of an America First foreign policy agenda. Let's give a warm welcome to Matt Gaetz.
Can you all hear me all right?
No.
Yes? No?
I was much shorter.
All right. Well, thank you all for having me. Sorry I was late. They were de-icing my plane to get in, which is a very disconcerting thought when you're on your way to almost anywhere other than Naples, Florida, where we have just decided we're against winter. And as we were driving in, I noticed some of the communities here are a little different than where I'm from in North Florida. We do a lot of door-to-door campaigning. Here, based on some of the homes I saw, I guess you have to buzz outside the gate to hope you can get in. It reminded me of my first campaign for public office. I was 26 years old. It was one of those hot, sticky summer days in Shalimar, Florida. And I knocked on the door, and these ladies, late 60s, all opened the door holding empty margarita glasses. And before I could say anything, one of them looked at me and said, "Well, it's Ethel's birthday. You must be the stripper." Matt Gaetz, I'm running for the state legislature. She said, "Well, if you're the stripper, we'll all vote for you." So when that election was over, I didn't know if I was going to win or lose, but I was getting 9 damn votes. Where all the $1 contributions came from on my finance report. Bertie thought he was the one that really invigorated the low-dollar donors. He hasn't done it the hard way. Again, thank you so much for having me. In Washington, GQ magazine called me the Trumpiest congressman in Trump's Washington. They wear it as they mean it as an insult. I wear it as a badge of honor. It is a tremendous joy to try to invigorate the America First movement with a sense of energy that I know that we feel all throughout the country. And at times, Washington tries to insulate itself from that populist change, from the reform that we believe can lift up all Americans and lead America to be the very best version of itself. I represent the district in Congress that has the highest concentration of active duty military. No one represents more troops than I do. And I'll tell you how proud I am. In Northwest Florida, if I could brag on my folks for a little bit, we're home of the Blue Angels, the highest end missile systems and weapon technology systems are tested at Eglin Air Force Base. We're the home of the Bunker Buster bomb and a number of other key innovations in our military technology. Every major cyber warrior in the Air Force will spend time training in my district. Every major cyber warrior in the Navy will do so as well. And again, I could not be prouder to be their congressman. And it is on their behalf that I'm so thankful that President Trump reformed our VA, rebuilt our military, and is respecting our flag. But a well-funded, a loved and respected military does not need to be so well worn. And that's why I want to thank the American conservative for being one of the voices consistently standing against the unfocused, endless, unconstitutional wars that President Trump ran against, and that our country still apparently is tempted by, particularly in the Middle East. President Trump really represents a different political philosophy, and I know you all have seen the drill from politicians. Every politician tells you that this election is the most important election that has ever been existed, right? So we're the ones running in it. We want you to think that it's got to be the most important for you to activate your donations and your friends and voter mobilization endeavors to try to make sure that we win. I would suggest that during this Trump era, we are in more than just an election where one series of ideas compete against another series of ideas, where politicians tell you, well, if my ideas prevail, we'll be in the land of milk and honey forever, and if the other side's ideas prevail, then locusts will eat out all of our eyes, and we will face Armageddon by the end of tomorrow. I think the reason this election is so important is because we are facing a political realignment in this country in terms of what it really means to be a conservative, and we have the chance to put the America First brand on our movement, and I think that is the way to ensure that it is both successful and prosperous. For far too long, the political coalitions have been something like this. You have sort of economic libertarians making common cause with social conservatives, and then war hawks, people who want to invade everywhere and invite everyone into our country. And those folks post up against, traditionally, the unions, non-white voters, and then whatever the counterculture is at the time. And certainly in our lifetimes we've seen that as everything from the anti-war movement to the drug legalization movement to now I think the left won't be happy unless we all get to work by flying around on our non-gender specific unicorn, bouncing from one Bernie Sanders drum circle to one rain dance with Pocahontas. Anything short of that is just our float. But in this realignment, I think President Trump truly does represent the front end of the wave, particularly in the area of our foreign policy, and that's the subject that I would like to discuss with you today. When President Trump went into South Carolina, folks predicted across the political spectrum in the primary election that this would be the end. This would be when Jeb Bush would finally come back and win the Republican nomination. I think Jeb Bush raised so much money and got so few delegates, he could buy each delegate their own archipelago in the Caribbean with campaign money. But Jeb was going to beat Trump in Carolina, and Donald Trump, lo and behold, went into this very pro-military, very pro-veteran state and essentially called George W. Bush a war criminal for starting the Iraq War. And then Donald Trump resoundingly won that election, and I believe reset our views on foreign policy in the America First movement. An America First foreign policy is not a military industrial first, complex first policy. It is not a lobbyist first policy. It is not a armchair general first policy. We have to make decisions about these matters of war and peace based on what is good for our country. And that seems so obvious, so simple, so powerful, but for far too long in our global affairs, it hasn't really mattered which party has won elections, because both sides are just serving as valets for the same special interests that have maintained the perpetual war machine. I can tell you how that affects me and how that affects the people in my district who I love and who I serve. I see it in the tearful goodbyes at airports. I see it in my constituents bargaining with God for the safe return of their loved ones. I see it in the broken marriages, the disrupted parenting, the veteran drug abuse, the suicide rates. I see it in the fact that the children's advocacy centers in my communities have to take on extra burden because it's so difficult to train people to go be war fighters and then reacclimate them to civilian life and family life. And already these ill-fated wars that we've gotten into during my life, I believe will have negative consequences for our country, for my district, and for families long into the future, because when you see these children whose parents have been on 8, 9 deployments, it fundamentally affects how they view the world, what they see as an organized and stable family. I just buried one of my constituents about a week ago at Arlington. He had died 3 days before Christmas. He was on his 9th deployment to the Middle East from the 7th Special Forces Group, and would have happily done a 10th or an 11th. What I can tell you is the folks who go and fight these wars, they are patriots who will go anywhere we send them and fight to the death just because we ask, and they won't ask questions. And that's why I think it is more important than ever that Congress start asking these questions. I'm a strong supporter of the president. I believe in his policies, but I do not believe that any president should be given an unlimited leash to be able to take our country into war. I believe strongly in the provisions of the Constitution that require the Congress to speak to these matters of war and peace. Not because we have some special know-how, not because we have some special expertise, but because making the commitment to spill our nation's most precious currency, the blood of our bravest patriots, that ought to require such a deep consensus that we ought to be able to convince broad swaths of the American electorate, and we ought to be able to convince the United States Congress. I'm convinced that far too many in Congress do not support our position in the war powers debate because they're cowards, because they don't want to have to vote for or against a lot of these engagements. Instead, they want to sit back and snipe and say, well, you didn't do this right, well, you didn't do that right, well, I'm not on the record as having to vote for it. But that is our job, and as long as I'm in Congress, on behalf of the constituents that I care deeply about, I'm going to try to push for broader acceptance of that non-delegable obligation that we have. These wars do not just cost us in terms of lives and death and interruptions in the American experience. They also cost us in real dollars that can be measured. I mean, we're bouncing up against $7 trillion that we have spent in the Middle East. $4 trillion in Iraq alone. $4 trillion is about as much money as our entire nation takes in tax revenue in a year. Would we ever have imagined in 2002 that this war would cost so much that we would literally, that every dollar we took from every American for federal taxes that we would go spend in that country over this extended period of time? The $7 trillion that we spend in the Middle East is more than the market capitalization of Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google combined. It is more than all of our nation's student loan debt and credit card debt combined. And so for all of this blood that we have spilled, for all of the sacrifice that we have called upon from our countrymen and women, for all of the money that we have spent, what can we honestly say that we have won? You know, I look at Afghanistan right now. The government of Afghanistan only controls 56% of the administrative districts in that country. That's down from 72% just 3 years ago. We have been trading the same villages back and forth in Afghanistan for 19 years. In Iraq, we see their government function now as practically a captive state of Iran. You know, you hear from folks in Washington with a straight face not to believe the elected Iraqi government when they say they don't want America present anymore. That, well, you know, they say different things to us privately than they say publicly. You know what, if I'm going out with a gal and she's telling me privately she likes me a lot, but is telling everybody else she's not that into me, she's probably not that into me. You probably trust what people say publicly about their feelings about you. I don't think that's too complicated of a concept to grasp. And in other places, we see similar results. I remember Hillary Clinton and some of the other warmongers on the left telling us that we had a moral obligation to go into Libya, of all places. You know, real morality is not saber rattling. Real morality, real toughness is standing up against the special interests who would sacrifice patriotic Americans just to keep the war machine running. And there is nothing moral, and there is nothing righteous about the slave trades that exist in Libya today as a consequence of that failed state. We look in Yemen, where one of the worst humanitarian crises on the globe is unfolding. And while America continues to fund Saudi Arabia's military, while we continue to sell them next generation weapon systems, we see them like literally damming up the rivers so that people starve and die in Yemen. I have counseled the president to try to disentangle ourselves from this conflict as quickly as possible. In Syria, the president did take advice from those of us who preach a more restrained and practical foreign policy. And rightly, President Trump has functionally removed us from the Syrian civil war. We had tens of Americans stuck between armies of tens of thousands who've been fighting each other for 100 years and will probably be fighting each other 100 years from now. And our presence there wasn't making anything more stable. If anything, it was creating targets and opportunity for the enemy. And so the president did the right thing. Today, we see in Iran, those same folks who were so sure that we had to go and invade Iraq and commit ourselves to this generation of tearing down and rebuilding in that country, want us now to march off to war with Iran. Now, I am under no illusions about Iran's treacherous regime, about their malign influence within the region, but I tend to think that the people that have the most to lose in these wars should be the ones fighting these wars. I tend to believe that rubble makes no trouble. Death from above is the right answer. Let's kill the terrorists as President Trump did, and then return home and not commit ourselves to endless time of occupation in Iran or any other country. And by the way, there are times when the fight is right and just and moral and necessary. We know that as a country that leads with morality and conviction and value. But pardon me if I'd like to finish rebuilding Alligator Alley before we rebuild Kandahar. Pardon me if I think that we ought to secure every inch of the U.S. border with Mexico before we send the first dollar, sailor, soldier, or Marine to secure Saudi Arabia's border with Yemen, Iraq's border with Iran, or Syria's border with Turkey. America First is not an isolationist view of the world. It's a view that says that we can actually be stronger by enhancing the resilience and strength and manufacturing base here in our own country. President Trump is proving that economic warfare actually works. If the dollar is stronger, if everywhere in the world people want to trade in the dollar, if this is the place that capital comes because we have the opportunity to feed investment into people's innovations and dreams and opportunities, then we will be more successful on the global stage trying to coerce behavior, not at the tip of a sword, but I think through the might of America's economic power. This is how we have won the major conflicts of our day. We fundamentally prevailed in the Cold War, not because of the sword, but because of our economic might and because of the fusion of our readiness with true American soft power. As I go back to Washington, there will continue to be those who want to draw us into these conflicts. Matter of fact, there's some who think we ought to be at war in Venezuela, if you could think that. Venezuela, I remember when Venezuela was like the crown jewel of Latin America. I grew up in Miami. The Venezuelans, they were the ones that had money and resources and were investing in businesses. But in Venezuela, those folks voted their way into socialism. And I think they're going to have to be the ones that fight their way out of it. I don't believe that liberty is the gift that America can give to other people, funded only with the currency of the blood of our bravest and most patriotic Americans. Again, thank you. So in this series of elections we're in, these Trump elections, I do fundamentally believe that we can pivot the discussion, where we can invigorate the populism on the right with the sense that we are not the party that wants to drag our nation into war. And I think that in the coming months during the election season, you will see the left do all that they can to try to paint President Trump as the pro-war candidate. The reality is that he is the most anti-war candidate of my lifetime. When he calls me and we chat about these things, he tells me, Matt, I am more anti-war than you are. One time he told me, Matt, I believe what you believe more than you believe it. I was retelling that story to Rand Paul, and he said, well, the president told me he was more of a libertarian than I am. Apparently, big time into superlatives. But I think I'll conclude this. There are really two kind of Republicans I've encountered in my time in Washington. Those who believe the Trump presidency, those like Paul Ryan, who think the Trump presidency is a condition to be managed. If we can all just get through this, he'll sign our bills, appoint our judges, and we can just pretend the things that are unsavory to our sensibilities don't exist. I am decidedly in the other camp. I believe that President Trump's time in office is an opportunity to be seized. An opportunity like we may never encounter again in our lives to be able to reset the narrative in this country, to reset the political discussion, and to ensure that the mistakes that have been made by political generations past, dragging us into unfocused war, will never happen again. We can be smarter, we can be more restrained, and we will be stronger as a consequence. Thank you all so much for having me. If you want to talk about like impeachment and all that, I'll be on Laura Ingraham tonight.
Question.
Yes, sir.
I feel somewhat, when I look back at the 2018 election, I sort of analogous to being an owner of a sports team, putting a great quarterback in place, President Trump, which I'm a strong backer, as you are. And what I see is my line just handing in all their equipment and 41 guys coming off the field, when I know from simple facts, from tables, that practically 90% of the House of Representative incumbents get reelected. Now I have 41 starters and they leave the field. Now what are you doing within the House of Representatives members to address that sort of situation?
We need better candidate recruitment, and there's a challenge with the way Republicans do that. Democrats go and find their fighters, and then they wrap the financial apparatus of campaigning around those people through platforms like Act Blue and the DCCC. Republicans, we wait around to see who's got the most money or who's able to get the most donations, and then that's our person. And sometimes we get great fighters out of that population, good members of Congress, but sometimes we get a lot of people who just want to stare at their nameplate, who just want to know when the next embassy party is, and who don't view service as a sacrificial opportunity to be a patriot for the country. If y'all are paying attention to cable news, the internet, social media, you see that we are all given the same opportunity to go and make the case for this president and for a transformational agenda, but everyone doesn't take that opportunity because it can be scary sometimes. Look, when you poke your head out of the hole and when you decide you're going to engage, there are folks that start shooting at you. That's kind of the way this thing works. If you've studied my service, I am not without my critics. I have plenty of folks who take their swings, but you know what? I'd rather be in the fight. I'd rather seize this opportunity than manage it. And if we can have some more backup, if we can have a better candidate recruitment effort, we will be able to achieve more out of the bucket of potential that this presidency represents. Yes, ma'am?
Why isn't the Democratic House doing more to tell, for example, Omar and Tlaib that they shouldn't be making anti-Semitic remarks?
It is troubling what we see coming out of the Democratic Party in terms of a new division on this question of anti-Semitism, our relationship with Israel, and frankly, it's so bizarre and unheard of that I don't know that we've really managed that in the best possible way. I can tell you that we've taken more than a dozen votes on the floor of the House of Representatives to condemn the BDS movement, to condemn anti-Semitism. Those used to be votes that were like, 400 to nothing, and now you're seeing far more division there. And I think that's problematic. I think that, frankly, when we have people in a broader coalition, we should invite that, and I hope they'll rejoin us in condemning some of those unfortunate elements of their movement. Yes, ma'am?
Having lived in Venezuela, I realized that when Chavez was elected, there was voter fraud. Fraudulent voting machines were taken down from Miami, and that contributed to his...
I think they sent him back to Broward County. Next election.
So my question is this. I realize that Judicial Watch has a number of lawsuits in the states to clean up the voter rolls, and I'm also well aware of the efforts on behalf of the Democrats to register or get illegals to vote. So do you think this is going to be resolved by the time of the elections? How do you foresee this issue of voter fraud
I am laser focused and perhaps too myopically focused on Florida. Because my constituents up in the Panhandle get real angry when they can't seem to count the votes right in Broward and Palm Beach County, and then everybody in Florida gets painted with the same brush of incompetence. And so when Ron DeSantis was elected, former JAG officer, lawyer, very, very tough, kind of by the books guy, he made very clear that there would be none of that nonsense in the state of Florida. And in his first week, he fired the supervisor of elections of Broward County. It is my belief that you don't have to convert everybody in the village. If you put a few heads on the stakes outside, you get a lot of converts. And I think that by Governor DeSantis kind of cleansing us of the individuals who were so incompetent at their job, I think it got a few more people to buy the right machines, to have the accountability measures in place, and to ensure that our state's elections are run correctly. So I am very focused on Florida, and I am confident that we are going to have the right result in this state because our governor will ensure it. But when you look at what they're doing in New Mexico, California, have you heard of this ballot harvesting thing? Yeah. The election day really is more of a suggestion. You can vote 8 days after. I mean, David Valadao won a congressional seat in Northern California, won it by 8 points on election day, and lost the election because in the weeks after, they went and harvested up a bunch of ballots of questionable legality. And so I do think we need a broader national look at that, but my initial focus has been the Sunshine State. Yes?
Good afternoon, Congressman. This is a very relevant question for young voters in Florida. I'm 24 years old and I just graduated from law school. The student debt has risen to, I believe, 89 billion in Florida, and the graduation rate is 45%, maybe just a little bit north. Now, there's a variety of reasons why the graduation rate is so low, but given that President Trump just signed an executive order in 2018 for free speech rights for students, are there any other issues that are going to be raised in Congress in the coming years for student rights on college campuses?
We ought to legislate those questions so they're enduring beyond just the president's executive order. I think that the real enduring nature of that comes with the Department of Justice's enforcement. And so what we're trying to do now is find bright young lawyers to hire into the Department of Justice who can go be vigilant on this, develop their careers, and then can be part of that professional corps that doesn't investigate political opponents, but actually ensures that Americans have the right to speak out without being retaliated against on college campuses. This student loan question is, I think, the big sleeper in the upcoming election. Because if you've got $60,000 in student loans and you kind of bought the dream that you were gonna go get that $100,000 job out of college, and instead, you're making 34 somewhere with that entry-level job trying to move up, this is the only issue because it predominates when you can get married, when you can buy a house, and really everything about the kind of life you live. And what we're starting to see in polling is that more and more baby boomers are starting to care about student loan debt because their child has just graduated. They didn't get that $100,000 job that was promised to everyone. And now baby boomers are saying, well, now how many generations am I going to have to support, of adults and other people? I think that for a large part of my life, college has been a scam for far too many Americans. I think people were fraudulently I think that the government, by the way, was part of the racket, because what we did was we went and created free cash in terms of these federally guaranteed loans for worthless degrees, so somebody could go and take out all this federally subsidized debt to go get a degree in underwater basket weaving, and there's no job in that space. If we did not have the federal government so involved in backing those loans, then they would bear a resemblance to the market, and you would not be able to get tens of thousands of dollars in loans to go get a philosophy degree, right? You could get those loans instead if you were going to go get something in STEM or an area where people are hiring. So in terms of what actual reforms I would support, this gets me out of step with some folks on the right, but I believe that there are circumstances where young people ought to be able to discharge their student loan debt through bankruptcy if they are able to demonstrate fraud. If you are fraudulently induced to a deal, I believe that you ought to be able to go and litigate that question against potential fraud feasors. And I also think that we ought to create a platform where people can invest in the success of young folks going into college. If this is an idea Marco Rubio has really detailed, But why isn't it? VCs can go invest in companies. Why couldn't venture capital funds be established to go and fund the degrees of 1,000 engineers or people in microbiology and then participate in revenue instead of having to all just participate in the debt? But I appreciate the question, and I do believe it's one of the sleepers of the upcoming election. It's the question of the generation. Yes, sir.
I've got a question, but then I want to follow up. I don't want you to answer me too quick. Is Social Security going broke? Question. Last month, my Social Security was reduced, my monthly check, 43%. Okay? 43%. A lot of us can relate. Now, I worked 50 years. I made the max every year for Social Security purposes. I trusted my government. 40 years of that 50, I was an independent contractor, which means I not only paid the employee share of Social Security, I paid the employer's share. So I paid double. Is it a wonder? I'm a veteran. Is it a wonder that we have a lack of confidence in Congress? You guys continually get escalated benefits, and yet we in the Social Security stream get nothing cut back, or maybe a 1%. I'd like for you to think about it, take that back.
All right. Yeah, I would say Social Security is not going broke as long as people are still trading in the US dollar, because Social Security would already be broke if we were not the global reserve currency. That is the reason why we are able to maintain the entitlement systems. I shouldn't say entitlement because people paid in. The safety net systems and the government-backed systems that we have right now. When you have this conversation with people my age, there is an appreciation that we will never see Social Security to the same degree that your generation has, because of the actuaries and because of the lack of workers that you saw during the baby boomer generation. So the answer is we're not going broke, but you better hope we never are not the global reserve currency, because if we are, then the gig will be up and Social Security will be the first place for extensive austerity. And I believe that the greatest risk to us not being the global reserve currency is to continue to spill trillions of dollars in unfocused wars. Yes, sir.
We have an awful lot of sanctuary this and sanctuary that going on in the country. Counties, states, cities, even one of the states. How do you envision that being dealt with? Because it just seems like we're sort of losing our grip on living by law. And
I worry it's more profound than that. I worry that we're losing our grip on a national identity. Borders, language, culture, common set of rules, this is what defines a country. America is not just a place that we all happen to coexist and live. It is a nation of ideas and values. And when you start to say, well, we're going to be a sanctuary against this or that, I think that you really start to call into question what it means to be a country. And so I think the federal government has unquestionably an interest in ensuring particularly that our immigration laws are followed, and I would withhold funds from those jurisdictions that refuse to abide by the law. And by the way, the president could do that. I mean, the president would not need to go to bended knee to Chuck Schumer to start creating even graver consequence for those communities who believe that they are an island unto themselves.
Pedro.
Yes.
Immigration, as a matter of fact, is something that I've been concerned with for a long time. I was born here. I'm very happy to be here, and it's been a great country to my family and to me for generations. In any event, I look at the fact that we have a 3.5% unemployment rate. I look at the fact that our immigration policies, laws, are not very conducive to bringing in people to help fill the vacuums that are being created in technology and what have you, due to the fact that we have such low unemployment. Are we going to do something about changing our immigration policies, our immigration laws, to allow more people with technology degrees to stay in this country after they get it? to allow people with technology degrees from outside to come into this country to fulfill expectations that our own employers have.
Yeah, there's no doubt that today in America there are 2 million jobs that are vacant because there are not enough qualified applicants to fill them in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so if those jobs ultimately are left unfilled, it is a sag on productivity. Likewise, there are concerns that if I'm American, I went to college, I got my $60,000, $70,000, $100,000 in student debt, now I'm ready to go and make money in a technology field. If there is an uncapped, endless ability to bring in lower wage, high skill workers, that does have a depressing effect on American wages. I do believe that the executive has the ability to sort of manage those levers in some sensitivity to the needs of the economy. But I think that if our first impulse is to bring people into our country to do the jobs that are vacant rather than trying to invigorate that workforce, it does put a rub against my America First philosophy. But the gestation on that takes time. I mean, we're having to invest now at the elementary and middle school level to try to get minds, wrapped around the foundations of coding and skills that weren't part of a rudimentary education even 10 years ago. So it's going to take some gestation to, I think, fill that gap.
Yes, just a couple of follow-ups to the student loan question. The Dave Ramsey Group, Anthony O'Neill wrote a book recently, Debt-Free Degree, showing people how they can get their degree without going into debt. I recommend that to people. As far as the Social Security question, there's an organization called Funding Our Future, which encourages people, as a website, go out there and sign up. It encourages people to let your representatives in Washington know that it's okay to have that conversation. Let's have that conversation going, because if things do not change by law in 2033, 34, if things don't change, and the sooner you act, the better it's going to be for everybody, benefits will decrease by 25% by law. So the longer we wait to make those changes, the more difficult it's going to be. Let your representatives know it's okay to have that conversation. My question has to do with impeachment. The big debate I hear from pundits on the conservative side is it better to have Mitch McConnell and the Republicans just say, no, there's nothing here, let's end this whole thing once we hear the arguments, or is it better to have a trial with witnesses and where that may go? What is your feeling on that?
I'm a litigator. If this was a car wreck case on this type of a fact pattern, it would not make it to a jury because it would be dismissed as a matter of law. When you look at the actual articles of impeachment, it's obstruction of Congress on a question that the Supreme Court has also already granted cert on. So the Supreme Court has said this is a legitimate question that reasonable people can disagree on. We have to deploy our judicial labor to answer the question, yet they're impeaching the president for it. And on the abuse of power articles, the whole deal is about some shakedown in the Ukraine, and every Ukrainian that we could find is showing up saying we weren't shut down. I mean, either these guys are the most ineffective shakedown artists on the planet Earth, or the person you're trying to shake down doesn't even know they're being shut down, or the whole thing is just so facially fraudulent that it is serving as a vehicle for people to work out their anxieties about the current president, whatever they may be. I am on the side of dismissal, of not giving this any more dignity than it deserves, and ending this national nightmare as fast as we can. And here's what I feel. I don't think my worldview is going to prevail on this, and I think it could be quite bad. Because here's how this is going to go down, all right? You're going to get a group of Republicans who don't particularly like the president and the Democrats in the room, and they're going to develop the witness exchange program. Well, which witnesses do you get and which witnesses do we get? Now, who among us trust the Senate Republicans to negotiate for the real witnesses? Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, the whistleblower, Adam Schiff for his involvement in the setup. And those are my top 4 witnesses. And there is no way the Republicans in the Senate are going to go for that. You think they're going to call one of their former colleagues and the screwed up kid of one of their former colleagues? There is no way. And so I fear that they're going to get, Bolton, Mulvaney, they're going to just throw a wrecking ball through executive privilege, and we're going to get some deputy undersecretary at the NSC. And so let's try to watch and make sure that that we don't have Republican senators losing their spine.
Time for one more question, right here.
Thank you. It's my understanding that there is a pending decision in Florida regarding resettlement of illegals. Is DeSantis going to approve this? We see what's happened in Minnesota and other areas.
Governor DeSantis has been very strong against refugee resettlement, that we are not absolutely required by law to have to do. And even on those, he's making sure every I is dotted and every T is crossed in the deal, or we're not taking them. I recall during the terrible natural events that impacted the Bahamas, sort of how the governor approached that, and I think it's the right approach. Where there were a few people coming in by plane or boat, you know, our system could absorb that and we were compassionate. But where you had these folks that were trying to like run cruise ships back and forth in the Bahamas, dumping hundreds of people into West Palm Beach with no health care, no lodging, no medical records, the governor was not going to just concede for the sake of virtue signaling to the left, who said that we all had to be great humanitarians by creating this challenge in the state of Florida. He stopped that. We worked with Homeland Security. We actually, instead of bringing every Bahamian over to do their paperwork in Florida, we sent folks into the Bahamas to try to work through eligibility for certain types of refugee programs. So I would say on the continuum, Governor DeSantis is very focused on the safety and security and prosperity of Floridians. And there should be no shame in that. Like, this is what we got to convince Republicans. Believing in putting our country first is not something we should be ashamed of. It's something we should be proud of. And when we have a governor that wants to make sure our state is successful, we should have his back 100%.
537-3, we have a commitment from all of District 19 to debate. So come join us.
Great. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all for coming out today. Hope you enjoy reading The American Conservative. It should be delivered to your house in about a month. Thank you.